Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we embark on a journey so long that our modern hurried lives feel like a single frantic blink. You are currently nestled under blankets, perhaps with the soft glow of a screen nearby, but I want you to feel the gritty dust of the East African Rift Valley settling on your skin. Imagine the savannah stretching out vast and silent, punctuated only by the low snort of grazers and the rustle of dry grass. You are not human yet, not in the way you define it now. You are something emergent. You stand upright, not as a point of pride, but out of necessity, to peer over the tall grass, to cool a smaller surface area in the searing equatorial sun, and to carry things which, trust me, is a game changer. You watch the sun track across the enormous sky, your world an unending cycle of forage and fear, and in this primitive existence, your only resume is your ability to survive another day. Here's a gentle reality check. If you, in your current soft convenience-addicted form, were suddenly dropped into the world of Homo habilis, the handyman, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than an hour without being someone else's lunch or dying of dehydration. You wouldn't know which berries are safe, you'd panic at the sight of a shadow that's actually a leopard, and your highly evolved opposable thumbs would be next to useless without a quick tutorial on how to bash two rocks together properly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And because I'm curious about your own tiny corner of the historical timeline, let me know your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, pushing back the curtain of time to where you begin. The very first shift we need to acknowledge, the one that sets your lineage apart, is a subtle noise. Chip, chip, chip. You're standing by a riverbed, maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, with a slightly hunched gait and a brain about half the size of yours, which, to be fair, is still a vast improvement over your tree-dwelling ancestors. You are Homo habilis, and you are clever. You don't have the teeth or the claws to tear through the tough hide of a recently downed antelope, scraps left by a passing pride of lions, but you have hands. You pick up a smooth, fist-sized river cobble and slam it against a block of volcanic rock, perhaps chert or obsidian. The result is a messy, uncontrolled fracture, but it produces something magical, a flake with an edge sharper than any naturally occurring tooth. This isn't just an accidental breakage, it's an intentional act of manufacture, and this basic tool is called an Oldowan chopper. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Oldowan stone tool industry, dating back as far as 2.6 million years ago, represents the earliest widely recognised evidence of stone tool use by hominins, marking the start of the Lower Paleolithic period. The chopper wasn't a weapon for hunting initially. It was essentially a primeval can opener. You use it to smash open marrow-rich bones left by predators, a crucial high-calorie food source that suddenly becomes accessible. You use it to strip tough vegetation, and perhaps even to shape a piece of wood. This simple innovation wasn't about being strong, it was about being efficient. It's the original life hack. A lion hunts all day for meat. You, with your sharpened rock, get a caloric payday from its leftovers in minutes. The subtle genius of the Oldowan technique is something modern scholars still puzzle over. It looks simple, smash rock on rock, but the technique requires foresight and a grasp of cause and effect, and you have to envision the finished tool inside the original stone, a significant cognitive leap. This is what differentiates you from other animals that might use a rock to crack a nut. You are modifying the rock itself to create a new, better tool. Historians still argue whether H. habilis were primarily scavengers, or if they engaged in early forms of opportunistic hunting, but their ability to process tough materials certainly expanded their diet and fueled the growth of those precious, energy-hungry brains. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Those early stone flakes are sometimes found embedded in the fossilised bones of the animals they processed, and believe it or not, archaeologists have performed experiments where they butcher entire carcasses using only these basic Oldowan tools. The results show that a single sharp flake is incredibly effective, even comparable to a modern steel blade for certain tasks like slicing through muscle or joint tissue. The sheer quantity of flakes required for a big job, however, turns your savannah worksite into a prehistoric construction zone littered with stone debris. It must have looked like the world's first and messiest kitchen renovation. The most transformative discovery, however, had nothing to do with stone, but with something far more intangible: fire. Imagine the fear, the sheer paralyzing terror when lightning strikes a dry tree during the savannah's dry season. A wall of consuming light, heat, and smoke, chasing everything with lungs. Your natural instinct is to run, to flee the devastating force. But then you notice something else. When the blaze subsides, leaving scorched earth, there is often a glowing ember, a patient-contained heat source. The gradual, almost accidental process of taming fire, moving from observing a natural wildfire to actively controlling and maintaining a flame, spans hundreds of thousands of years. It's highly probable that Homo erectus, the descendant of H. habilis, was the first to truly master it, but the seeds of fascination are sown earlier. Early evidence for the controlled use of fire is complex and debated, but sites like the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa show burnt bone fragments suggesting controlled hearths existed perhaps 1 million years ago. But for your ancient self, this discovery is nothing short of a divine miracle. First, cooking. The moment you roast a piece of meat or a root vegetable, your life changes forever. Cooking breaks down tough fibres, kills harmful bacteria, and most importantly predigests the food. This means you extract far more calories and nutrients with less chewing and less digestive effort. You are no longer spending half your day gnawing on raw, tough things. This caloric efficiency provides the surplus energy needed to grow a bigger, more complex brain. It's no exaggeration to say that without the discovery of fire, you would not be smart enough to be listening to this. You'd be too busy chewing. Second, protection. A ring of fire around your sleeping place is the first genuine deterrent against the lurking night predators. A lion or a hyena, formidable as they are, respects the glow and the heat. The fire is your first security system, allowing a longer, safer period of deep sleep. Third, warmth and light. In the cold savannah night, or later in the deep shelter of a cave, fire extends your usable day. It allows you to gather, to sit in the mesmerizing flicker, and to begin what might be called the first truly social activities. You are no longer scattered individuals hiding in the dark. You are a group, sharing the warmth and the light. This is where language truly begins to gestate, in the shared space around a campfire. It's the original meeting space. You are communicating, coordinating, and solidifying the social bonds that are essential to your survival. You now possess the two essential keys to unlock the next chapter of human history: the tool to process the world and the fire to process your food and control your environment. This is the foundation upon which every subsequent civilization will be built: a sharpened stone and a controlled flame. And as you huddle around that flickering glow, sharing a bit of roasted meat, you are unknowingly preparing for the biggest adventure yet, leaving your ancestral home and setting out to see what else the world has to offer. The first great migration is already stirring in your bones, a genetic whisper that says, go west, or east, or north, just go. You're about to walk out of Africa. The fire is glowing, casting long, nervous shadows on the cave wall, and the smell of wood smoke and roasted marrow is a scent you instinctively associate with safety in the end of the day. You've mastered the Alderman chopper, your mind is sharper thanks to cooked food, and your legs are long and powerful, built for endurance, not just scrambling up a tree. You're no longer Homo habilis, you're now Homo erectus, the upright man, and the shift is profound. Your skull is low and thick, your brow ridge is heavy, a protective visor against the relentless sun, but your body is recognizably human. You are the ultimate walking machine, a biological marvel of energy-efficient bipedalism. The world is suddenly too small for you. You realize that staying in one place means eventual scarcity. The big game you favor moves, the berry bushes are stripped bare, and the neighboring group of your kind is getting a little too close for comfort. There's an innate, restless impulse that compels you to look past the next ridge. This isn't a planned, strategic colonization. It's a slow, generational seep. A simple matter of following the resources. A band moves 10 miles, settles for a year, has a few children, and those children in turn repeat the pattern, moving another 10 miles. Over countless generations, that 10-mile step becomes a continental leap. Homo erectus is the first hominin to leave Africa, and this is your mainstream historical fact. They are the true pioneers, the original global tourists, except their souvenir was just a slightly different view of the same endless horizon. Imagine the sheer audacity of this journey. They had no maps, no backpacks, no GPS, just the sun, the stars, and the ancient echoing knowledge of their grandmothers. They walked out of the cradle of humanity, across the land bridges exposed by fluctuating global climates, through the Middle East and into Asia and Europe. Sites like Dmanisi in modern-day Georgia provide stunning evidence of their early arrival, showing H. erectus fossils dating back as far as 1.8 million years ago, an astonishingly early exit from Africa. They must have encountered environments drastically different from the familiar savanna. Colder nights, different predators, new diseases, and plant life they couldn't immediately trust. The secret to this success wasn't brute force, it was technological innovation. Your H. erectus hands are now fashioning something more sophisticated than the simple Oldowan chopper. You are creating the Aculean hand axe, a tool so perfectly symmetrical and elegant that it looks like a sculpted work of art. This is your quirky tidbit. The Aculean hand axe is one of the longest used tools in human history, remaining virtually unchanged for over 1 million years. It's an incredibly versatile piece of kit, used for butchering, skinning, woodworking, and perhaps even for digging up tubers. A multi-tool so effective that if you found one today, you'd appreciate its balance. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes you just nail the design on the first try, like the paperclip or the wheel, though the wheel is still a long way off for you. The hand axe required immense cognitive skill to produce. To strike the stone repeatedly and symmetrically to achieve that characteristic teardrop shape, or biface, demands planning, coordination, and a mental template of the desired outcome. This is a massive jump in brain power from the opportunistic smashing of Homo habilis. You aren't just reacting to the rock, you're imposing your will upon it. The repetitive, skillful labour of flint knapping likely even contributed to the development of early language and teaching, as the master craftsman had to show and explain the precise flaking sequences to their apprentices. It's the original apprenticeship where a slip of the wrist means a ruined rock and a hungry night. As you trek through new continents, your use of fire becomes non-negotiable. It's not just for cooking now, it's a tool for adapting to colder climates. In Asia, H. erectus populations thrived, leaving behind evidence at sites like Zhoukoudian, Peking Man, in China, which shows extensive evidence of fire use and large-scale hunting. Imagine the contrast. You can now survive winters that would have instantly killed your ancestors. Fire is the shield that allows you to penetrate deeper into the temperate zones. But the Aculean industry presents one of the greatest open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the Aculean hand axe was primarily a utilitarian tool for hunting and processing, or if its remarkable symmetry and sheer abundance at certain sites suggest it had a social, ritualistic, or even display function, perhaps acting as a status symbol or a prehistoric equivalent of a mating gift. Some axes are so perfectly flaked and too large to be practical, suggesting they were purely for showing off the craftsman's skill. Were they just really fancy hammers, or were they the first engagement rings? The debate continues, adding a delightful layer of vanity to our otherwise strictly pragmatic ancestor. Now, as you settle in a new territory, your social structure is forced to adapt. You are still hunter-gatherers, but the game is often bigger, requiring more coordinated efforts. Hunting a massive, lumbering megafauna requires communication, planning, and trust. You can't just charge in solo. You need to drive the animal into a bog or off a cliff. This need for cooperative effort strengthens the group dynamic. You learn to specialise. Some members are better at tracking, some at tool-making, and others at the dangerous final kill. Crucially, you develop the ability to care for the infirm. At Dmanisi, a skull was found belonging to an older individual who had lost all but one of his teeth long before his death. This means he could not have chewed his food. Someone, his family, his group, must have chewed it for him and fed him for years. This is a stunning demonstration of early compassion and social dependency, suggesting that the bonds of empathy were already woven into the fabric of your society. You're not just surviving as an individual, you're surviving as a unit, sharing the burden and the bounty. Life is a relentless cycle of movement. You track the seasons, you follow the herds, and you map the landscape not on paper, but in your muscle memory and your shared oral tradition. Every water source, every reliable shelter, every known migration path is a piece of cultural knowledge passed down through grunts, gestures, and the developing language structure. While the language of H. erectus was undoubtedly basic compared to yours, they possessed the physiological adaptations and the social complexity necessary for a proto-language. a significant advance that allowed for planning and the transfer of technical skills. You are beginning to speak the world into existence. The global spread of H. erectus is a story of incredible resilience and adaptive capacity. They eventually colonized large parts of Asia, giving rise to regional variants like Java man and Peking man. The sheer volume of time they dominated the Earth, over 1.5 million years, is mind-boggling. To put that in perspective, the time between you and Julius Caesar is a blink compared to the duration of the H. erectus epoch. They were, evolutionarily speaking, the most successful and longest surviving species of the Homo genus. They truly perfected the art of just existing, spreading their genetic and technological seeds across continents. But time doesn't stand still, even for the most successful species. As you trek further north and west into the freezing fringes of the Eurasian landmass, environmental pressures begin to shape you and your descendants in new and dramatic ways. The sheer scale of the journey means that small, isolated populations begin to evolve independently, specialized for their particular corner of the world. In Asia, some lines will continue to evolve, while in Europe and the Near East, the cold, demanding environment will push one particular lineage to become stockier, tougher, and incredibly intelligent. You are approaching the limits of the tropical world, and the ice ages are beginning to bite. As you stand on the edge of a great forest, shivering slightly despite the nearby fire, your gaze is drawn to a towering shaggy beast, a woolly mammoth. Hunting it is terrifying, but surviving without its meat, fat, and hide is impossible in the coming cold. You clench your finely flaked hand axe, readying for the cooperative kill, preparing to use not just brute strength but cunning. You are now leaving the broad, successful highways of H. erectus and stepping onto the divergent paths that lead to the rich, fascinating, and ultimately tragic story of your European cousins. You're heading toward the land of the cave bear and the great ice sheets, the land of the Neanderthal. You step out of the mild, ancient heat of the Near East and into a world utterly transformed. A Europe gripped by the relentless, grinding cold of the Ice Age. The vast open savannas are replaced by chilling tundra and dense, dark coniferous forests. The air is sharp and every breath feels like a commitment. You're following the herds of reindeer and bison, but you've lost the streamlined gait of your Homo erectus ancestors. The demands of this brutal environment have sculpted your body into something new. You are shorter, far more muscled, and incredibly robust. Your limbs are stouter, your chest is barrel-shaped, and your nose is large and prominent, an internal radiator designed to warm the frigid air before it hits your delicate lungs. You are now a Neanderthal. This is not some clumsy, brutish caveman stereotype from a poorly drawn cartoon. You're a biological masterpiece of cold-weather adaptation. Your brain, in fact, is on average slightly larger than the average modern human brain, though shaped differently, reflecting the intense cognitive demands of survival in the European Pleistocene. You are tough, resourceful, and deeply rooted in your landscape. This physical robustness is your mainstream historical fact. Neanderthals were highly adapted to cold glacial environments, possessing a distinctive skeletal morphology characterized by a stocky build, heavy brow ridges, and great strength. If you were to arm wrestle a Neanderthal, you'd instantly regret every gym session you ever skipped. Your toolkit has also undergone a massive refinement. You've moved beyond the general-purpose hand axe. You now employ the Mysterian industry, a collection of sophisticated stone tools produced using the Levallois technique. Imagine a master sculptor carefully preparing a stone core, striking it in a precise, measured way, like peeling an onion, before delivering the final, decisive blow that detaches a perfect, pre-shaped flake. This flake is your finished tool, a scraper, a point, or a spearhead. This method is incredibly efficient. It conserves raw material and allows you to create highly specialized tools tailored for specific tasks, such as processing tough animal hides for clothing, or hafting a point onto a wooden shaft to create a durable thrusting spear. Hunting is your lifeblood, and you are not a scavenger. You are an apex predator. Your prey includes massive, terrifying animals like the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhino, and cave bears. This is a communal, high-risk endeavour. The spears you fashion are designed for close-quarters confrontation, suggesting you hunted by surrounding and overwhelming large animals in ambushes. The evidence is clear. Neanderthal skeletons often show a high incidence of fractures, particularly around the head and neck, injuries eerily similar to those found in modern professional rodeo riders. Your life is literally one dangerous physical confrontation after another. You're essentially the world's first extreme athlete. Yet, despite this brutal existence, a complex cultural life emerges. You do not just live to hunt, you also think. You bury your dead. This isn't just about disposing of a body, it's about ritual. At sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, skeletons have been found carefully laid to rest, sometimes with evidence suggesting flowers or grave goods were placed with them. This points to a nascent understanding of an afterlife, or, at the very least, profound grief and respect for the departed. This is a huge leap toward abstract thought and spiritual contemplation. This spiritual depth leads us to a quirky tidbit. Some skeletal remains and artifacts suggest that Neanderthals may have engaged in a cult of the cave bear. Massive, imposing bear skulls have been found deliberately placed in high, prominent positions within certain caves, sometimes in stone niches. While some scholars dismiss this as coincidence or bear activity, others interpret it as evidence of early totemism or ritualistic reverence for a powerful animal spirit. Imagine the scene. Deep in a freezing cave, the flickering light of a fire illuminating a massive preserved bear skull. A silent, powerful monument to the shared struggle for survival. It suggests they saw the world as more than just a resource bin. It was a place populated by spirits and power. The development of sophisticated jewellery and personal ornamentation also marks your journey. While once thought to be exclusively a Homo sapiens trait, evidence suggests that Neanderthals too prized aesthetics. You find perforated animal teeth and shells, sometimes coated with ochre pigment, implying they were strung together as necklaces or worn as pendants. Some of the oldest known jewellery fragments have been found in Neanderthal sites, crafted from eagle talons. This drive to adorn the body is universal, and shows that the desire to signal status, attract a mate, or simply feel beautiful did not begin with us. It began with you, the Neanderthal, decorating your tough, scarred neck with a piece of polished bone. But you, the Neanderthal, faced immense challenges. Your population density was incredibly low, scattered in small, isolated groups across a huge, often inhospitable continent. Your highly specialised hunting style, while effective, might have been less adaptable than that of the newcomers who would eventually arrive. You were perfectly designed for Europe, but when the climate began to fluctuate wildly, those specialisations became a burden rather than a benefit. You were a high-performance sports car, great on the racetrack, but not so good when the terrain suddenly turns into a mud pit. This brings us back to the great open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the decline and eventual disappearance of Neanderthals was primarily due to direct competition and conflict with anatomically modern humans, or if their smaller, isolated populations succumbed to climate change and complex internal factors like lower fertility rates and disease. It's a complex puzzle. Did the new arrivals, Homo sapiens, simply outcompete you for resources with a broader, more flexible diet? Or did the repeated dramatic swings in glacial climate stress your highly specialised megafauna hunting economy past its breaking point? Or was it something far more intimate? Did the two groups interbreed so extensively that the distinctive Neanderthal genome was simply diluted and absorbed? The genetic evidence, a modern miracle of science, offers a fascinating clue. Many non-African modern humans carry between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. This means that at some point, likely in the Near East before H. sapiens pushed fully into Europe, there was interbreeding. Remember those H. erectus travellers who left Africa? They eventually gave rise to you, the Neanderthal, in Europe. And now, another wave of migrants, the H. sapiens, is arriving from Africa, and they are meeting you, their long-separated cousin. The encounters must have been dramatic, sometimes hostile, but clearly at other times intimate. You didn't just vanish. A part of you became immortal, woven into the very fabric of those who replaced you. We carry your legacy in our genes, genetic snippets that affect our hair colour, our sleep patterns, and even our immune response to certain diseases. You're quite literally still with us. Your time as the dominant hominin in Europe is drawing to a close. As Homo sapiens spreads, with their lighter build, greater range of projectile weapons, and possibly more complex social networks and communication, the pressures on the Neanderthal way of life intensify. You retreat into isolated pockets, the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, clinging to the caves and mountains that have always been your stronghold. The final vestiges of your kind disappear around 40,000 years ago, not in a massive, catastrophic battle, but in a gradual fading echo. You just stop leaving bones behind. You stop leaving tools behind. The last fire is banked, and the final shadow retreats. But before you totally fade, there is another, even more mysterious player on the world stage, a hominin known only by the smallest fragments of bone and the deepest secrets of our DNA. While you were battling the cold in Europe, your other cousin was thriving in the vast wild expanse of Asia. They are the ghost in the machine, the mystery that modern science has only just begun to unearth. As the last embers of the Neanderthal fires die out, we turn our gaze eastward to a cave in Siberia, to a tiny finger bone that will rewrite the story of the ancient human family tree. We are about to meet the Denisovans. The bitter cold of Ice Age Europe recedes, and you now travel far eastward, across the vast rolling steppes and into the rugged mountains of Siberia. The climate here is equally demanding, but the environment is dramatically different. A mix of high altitude, deep forests and secluded caves. We leave the familiar, heavily built Neanderthal behind and look for evidence of a contemporary, yet far more elusive cousin. We arrive at a place called Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains. This unassuming hole in the rock, named after an old hermit who once lived there, holds one of the most significant and strangest secrets of ancient human history. In 2010, an analysis of a tiny fingerbone fragment, a piece so small it might easily be overlooked, and later a tooth, revealed something astonishing. The DNA extracted from these fragments belonged neither to modern humans nor to Neanderthals. It belonged to an entirely new, previously unknown population of hominins, now dubbed the Denisovans. You are meeting your mystery cousin, known less from a complete skeleton and more from a digital ghost, resurrected through the miracle of ancient genomics. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Denisovans are an extinct species of archaic human identified primarily through DNA sequencing of scant fossil remains found in Denisova Cave, proving that at least 3 distinct hominin groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans and modern humans, coexisted across Eurasia. Imagine the landscape of 50,000 years ago, not as a straight line of evolution, but as a messy, branching family tree with 3 distinct cousins, robust, cold-adapted Neanderthals in the west, pioneering, adaptable H. sapiens spreading out of Africa, and the large, silent Denisovans holding court in the east. It's a traffic jam of ancient humanity. What did the Denisovans look like? Based on the handful of remains, it's difficult to paint a full portrait, but the fossilised molar found suggests they possessed massive teeth, far larger than those of Neanderthals or modern humans. The fingerbone indicates they were probably robust, similar to Neanderthals, which makes sense for the cold, high-altitude regions they inhabited. They were likely masters of their rugged terrain, possibly exploiting resources that the others couldn't manage. They are defined by their genetics, which reveal an incredibly deep split from the lineage that led to both Neanderthals and H. sapiens, suggesting they left Africa in a much earlier migration wave, setting up shop in Asia and evolving in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. The true significance of the Denisovans, however, lies in where their DNA ended up. This is your quirky tidbit. The highest concentration of Denisovan DNA, reaching up to 6%, is found in the genomes of modern-day Melanesians, particularly the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and the surrounding islands. This staggering genetic footprint means the Denisovans were not confined to a single cave in Siberia. They must have been spread across a vast sweep of Asia, and at some point they met and interbred with the ancestors of these modern populations as they migrated through Southeast Asia and into Oceania. Think of the distance. A tiny bone from Siberia is connected by blood to people living near the equator. It suggests a migration route that covered thousands upon thousands of miles, painting a picture of an ancient, sprawling presence across the continent. But the most fascinating genetic gift they gave us is an adaptation for high-altitude survival. Modern populations living in the high-altitude, oxygen-starved Tibetan plateau possess a gene, EPAS1, which helps regulate blood hemoglobin and allows them to function efficiently in low-oxygen environments. Genomic analysis revealed that this gene did not evolve recently in Homo sapiens. It was acquired through interbreeding with the Denisovans. Your modern self, if suddenly dropped on Everest, would suffer acute mountain sickness. The Tibetans carry a piece of Denisovan DNA that saves them. It's a clear example of beneficial interspecies mixing. H. Sapiens acquired a survival hack from their ancient cousins, allowing them to rapidly colonize a demanding new environment. This powerful intersection of ancient populations fuels a major open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the relationship between Denisovans, Neanderthals, and H. sapiens was defined more by outright competition and population displacement, or by repeated instances of peaceful contact and crucial genetic exchange that bolstered modern human adaptability. The Denisova cave itself is a microcosm of this debate. Deep layers contain Neanderthal tools and DNA, others contain Denisovan DNA, and later layers contain tools made by modern humans, perhaps with some technological overlap. It's a multi-species time capsule, suggesting that for thousands of years the cave was a shared, or at least sequential, home for different branches of your family tree. Did they fight over the best sleeping spots? Did they share fire or simply avoid each other on the trails? We don't know, but the genetic evidence screams of intimate contact. The idea that our successful spread across the globe was partly fueled by sleeping with the locals is a wonderfully humbling thought. We didn't just conquer with our better tools and complex language. We absorbed the local knowledge and physiological adaptations of our archaic relatives through hybridization. We became a patchwork of their successes. Your resistance to certain diseases, your ability to handle altitude, perhaps even the texture of your hair, all of these things may be little genetic souvenirs left by Neanderthals and Denisovans. As we move on from the shadows of Denisova Cave, we have to acknowledge that the Denisovans are an ongoing mystery. We know almost nothing of their culture, their burial practices, or their art. They are the great silent witness of ancient Asia. Did they make art? Did they have rituals? The only definitive tools found with their remains are the early Mousterian style, similar to those of Neanderthals, suggesting they were equally proficient and intelligent stone tool users. But their story remains largely unwritten, a testament to how much we still have to discover about the deep human past. Now, as the Ice Age continues to rage, you, the Homo sapiens who are carrying a small beneficial percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, are poised to take over the planet. You have the tools, the fire, the communication skills, and now the genetic boosts. As you press into new territories, the sheer demands of the environment spur an explosion of creativity and technical ability. You need better tools for specialized hunting, better clothing for deeper cold, and better ways to communicate complex strategies across larger territories. The focus shifts from simply surviving to thriving, a period of intense innovation called the Upper Paleolithic. This is where we see the final, decisive steps that separate your direct ancestors from all the others. The next time you look at a sophisticated hunting spear or a finely sewn piece of clothing, remember that it wasn't just Homo sapiens who survived. It was a blend of successful hominins, all contributing their strengths. The Neanderthal was too focused on brute force. The Denisovan was perhaps too specialized in Asia, but H. sapiens, with its flexible diet, capacity for long-distance communication, and willingness to interbreed, became the ultimate generalist, a Swiss Army knife of ancient hominin success. You are the inheritor of a complex shared legacy. The stage is set for a revolution in toolkit technology, art, and long-range strategy. You are now fully established as Homo sapiens, the wise man, having successfully absorbed the genetic fortitude of your Neanderthal and Denisovan cousins. Your body is less bulky, designed for long-distance running and the rapid dissipation of heat, but your mind is where the real revolution is happening. The physical spread out of Africa has triggered an equally dramatic internal expansion, a burst of creativity and technical ingenuity known as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. You're no longer just surviving, you're engineering survival, turning raw materials into highly specialized instruments. The defining characteristic of this new age is standardization and specialization. The simple, bulky hand axe is finally retired, replaced by a sophisticated, diverse toolkit tailored for specific jobs. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Upper Paleolithic saw the widespread adoption of the blade technology, a method for producing long, standardized, and highly versatile stone flakes from prepared cores, allowing for more efficient resource use and the creation of composite tools. Imagine the flint knapping process now. Instead of just bashing rocks, you meticulously prepare a narrow cylindrical core. Then, with precise controlled pressure, often using an antler punch or a hammer made of bone, you detach long, slender flakes or blades. This is a quantum leap in efficiency. From a single, modest block of flint, you can produce many times more cutting edge than you could with the old Herculean method. This surplus of sharp, standardized components allows you to think of tools not as single-piece items, but as composite structures. You are now constructing hafted tools. This means attaching your sharp stone blades to handles made of wood, bone, or antler. You create sophisticated spear throwers, or atlatls, which are essentially levers that dramatically increase the velocity, distance, and penetrating power of your spears. The spear thrower is the first great projectile weapon, and it's the original equalizer. It allows you to hunt massive, dangerous prey like the mammoth or bison from a safe distance, minimizing the brutal, bone-breaking close-quarters combat that was the Neanderthal's specialty. You're trading sheer physical strength for physics and ingenuity. You've realized that working smarter is a much better long-term survival strategy than working harder. But the innovation doesn't stop with hunting weapons. Necessity is the mother of invention, and nothing is more necessary in a glacial environment than staying warm. This leads to the discovery of the sewing needle. This is your quirky tidbit. The invention of the bone needle, sometimes made from the slender leg bones of small animals, allowed Homo sapiens to fashion fitted, layered clothing for the first time, revolutionizing cold-weather survival. The Neanderthal, remember, was tough, but likely wore simple, draped hides. You, however, are now using a needle, a tiny, meticulously crafted instrument with a small hole drilled in one end, to sew together cured animal skins using threads made from sinew or plant fibres. This allows for tailored parkas, trousers, mittens and boots, clothing that seals out the wind and traps precious body heat much more effectively than loose wraps. This tailored wardrobe is not merely a fashion statement, it's a technological barrier against the killing cold. It allows you to survive in far harsher climates and for longer periods outdoors. It allows the women of the group, who are often the primary processors of hides and creators of clothing, to become essential engineers of survival. Without the needle, the colonization of the deepest northern latitudes would have been impossible. The materials themselves also expand dramatically. You no longer rely solely on stone. Bone, antler and ivory, materials that are scarce and difficult to work, become foundational to your technology. They are lighter, more durable for certain applications, and can be carved into complex shapes. You create harpoons with barbs for fishing, specialized hooks, eyed needles, and delicate engraved tools for working leather and wood. This mastery of multiple raw materials, a multimedia approach to toolmaking, is a hallmark of H. sapiens' ingenuity and flexibility. You're learning to exploit every single resource provided by the carcass of a successful hunt. The efficiency of this new technology supports a crucial change in your lifestyle: population density and dispersal. Because you can extract more utility from less raw material, and you can hunt effectively in a broader range of environments, your population expands and your ability to interact over vast distances increases. This leads to the establishment of trade and exchange networks, the first hints of interregional commerce. You start finding obsidian, a prized volcanic glass for toolmaking hundreds of miles from its source. This means people are travelling, or more likely passing goods from one group to the next. This exchange is critical because it introduces an element of social insurance. If a local flint source runs dry, you have trading partners who can supply you. This reduces the risk of local resource failure and strengthens social bonds between widely separated groups. This interconnectedness is another major advantage you hold over the more isolated Neanderthal groups we discussed. Your groups are more fluid, more adaptable, and ultimately more resilient. But of course, not every detail of this innovative period is agreed upon, which brings us to the open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent explosion of technological and artistic innovation during the Upper Paleolithic was a single, abrupt cognitive leap enabled by genetic change or fully developed language, or if it was a gradual accumulation of practical knowledge and skills amplified by environmental pressures and greater population density. Did your ancestors suddenly wake up smarter, or did the simple fact of having more people interacting with each other, sharing knowledge across wider networks, simply accelerate the rate of innovation? Many now lean toward the latter view, that the cognitive machinery was in place earlier, but the social and demographic conditions were finally right for the creative dam to burst. It's a chicken and egg question. Did the tools create the complexity, or did the complexity allow for the tools? In this period, Your very way of life is perfected. You are the ultimate hunter-gatherer. Your survival is a masterpiece of applied ecology. You understand the seasons, the migration patterns, and the subtle signs of the landscape better than any being before or since. You organize highly effective cooperative hunts, not just for the meat, but for the hides, the bones, the fat, and the sinew, all essential commodities in your new toolkit. You are living evidence that a technologically sophisticated, complex culture can exist without agriculture or permanent settlements. The development of these sophisticated tools, from the bone needle that allowed for fitted clothing to the atlatl that turned a spear into a missile, was the final, decisive move that secured H. sapiens' global dominance. It allowed you to outcompete every other hominin, not through brute force, but through superior engineering and logistics. The stage is now set for us to examine exactly what that hunter-gatherer life entailed. The structure of the band, the cooperative hunting strategies, and the delicate balance between freedom and necessity. You have the gear. Now it's time to see how you used it, moving from the technology of survival to the society of survival. You've acquired the bone needle and the atlatl. Your kit is complete. Now let's discard the romanticized and often inaccurate image of the solitary caveman. Your life as a hunter-gatherer during the Upper Paleolithic was surprisingly one of the most successful and arguably leisured existences in human history. You didn't just survive, you thrived within a system that demanded an intimate, comprehensive knowledge of your ecosystem. Your existence was a continuous moving mastery of the environment, a perfect dance between necessity and resource management. You live in a mobile band, typically consisting of 25 to 50 individuals, your extended family. This small number is critical. It's large enough for effective defense, complex cooperative hunting, and finding mates outside the immediate kinship group, but small enough to remain incredibly agile. When resources in one area are depleted, you simply pack up and move. There are no mortgages, no fixed borders, no overflowing bins, just the open landscape and the ancient rhythm of the seasons. This high degree of mobility is your mainstream historical fact. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were highly mobile, adapting their movements to the seasonal availability of resources, which required low population density and flexible social structures. The core of your daily life is not an endless, frantic scramble for food, as modern society often assumes. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that the actual time spent on subsistence activities, hunting, gathering, processing, was often significantly less than what modern humans spend working in an office. You work hard, often in short, intense bursts, but you enjoy substantial periods of leisure dedicated to tool repair, storytelling, socializing, and the creation of art. Your diet is incredibly varied, rich in protein and fiber, ensuring that you generally avoid the nutritional deficiencies that would later plague early agricultural communities. Your social structure is fundamentally egalitarian. There are no kings, no permanent chiefs, and no rigid hierarchies of wealth, because there is no way to accumulate surplus wealth that can't be carried on your back. Leadership is fluid and based on skill and charisma. The best hunter leads the hunt. The most skilled flint napper is sought for tools. The wisest elder offers counsel. Power is distributed, not concentrated. This lack of permanent social stratification ensures that conflict is often resolved by fission. If two families can't get along, one simply leaves to join another band or forms a new one. Let's talk about the hunt, the centerpiece of your cooperative life. As you remember from the last section, you hunt megafauna. Woolly rhinos, giant elk, and the immense woolly mammoths. This requires extraordinary coordination and communication. A group of 10 to 20 hunters and beaters must drive the animal, perhaps into a sinkhole, a narrow defile, or a cleverly concealed pit. This is where your sophisticated language, developed over millennia around the campfire, is essential. You must quickly communicate complex tactics, flank left, hold the line, throw the spear now. After a successful kill, the true cooperation begins, the division of the meat. This practice of meat sharing is a crucial mechanism of social bonding and insurance. The hunter who made the kill doesn't necessarily get the largest share. Complex, culturally determined sharing rules ensure that the meat is distributed widely across the entire band, based on kinship and reciprocal ties. This means that when one hunter has an unsuccessful day, they are still fed by the success of others, and they will in turn share their bounty next time. It reduces risk for everyone and reinforces the social contract. I feed you today, you will feed me tomorrow. This is the oldest, most reliable form of social security. This reliance on sophisticated cooperation brings us to a quirky tidbit. The discovery and use of complex traps and snares, particularly for smaller, more consistent game, may have been a primary domain of women and children, providing a reliable baseline calorie source that supplemented the high-risk, high-reward hunting of the men. While the dramatic mammoth hunt gets all the glory in documentaries, the steady collection of nuts, roots, tubers, eggs, and small game was the unsung foundation of the Paleolithic diet. This often overlooked gathering, which provides a more reliable food source, may have been the true survival engine of the band. It also highlights the crucial, equally valued roles played by both men and women in the hunter-gatherer economy. The concept of territory for a mobile band is very different from your modern idea of a fixed boundary. You have a vast home range, a landscape you know intimately, and within it there are crucial resource points, a reliable spring, a good source of flint, a migratory river crossing. You move between these nodes, leaving the land time to replenish itself. There is no permanent damage to the ecosystem. You live in balance with it, not in conquest of it. Your footprint is light and transient. The most profound open scholarly debate of this era centres on communication. Historians still argue whether the complexity of cooperative hunting and far-flung trade networks in the Upper Paleolithic necessitates that Homo sapiens had already developed fully modern language, with grammatical syntax and recursive structures, or if simpler proto-languages augmented by gesture and visual signs were sufficient for their needs. The scale of organisation required to coordinate a multi-band hunt for weeks, or to establish a long-distance trade route for obsidian, seems to demand the ability to discuss complex scenarios that are not immediately present, to talk about the past and the future, to abstract. Did the need to tell a detailed story of a previous hunt, or plan the next one, drive the final evolution of a language? It seems highly likely that this intense, communal, planning-heavy lifestyle was the pressure cooker that forged the modern human mind. As you look around your temporary camp, the fire crackling, hides draped over a simple structure of bent branches, tools being meticulously repaired, you realise this is a lifestyle that defined your species for 95% of its existence. It was a life of intense physical demands, yes, but also one of profound skill, deep social connection, and a perfect ecological awareness. You're never truly alone, and your survival is always a shared effort. This fundamental rhythm of foraging and moving, of sharing and socialising, has been etched into your modern subconscious, creating perhaps an ancient restless yearning for the open road and the simplicity of the wild. But as successful as this nomadic life is, a slow change is already beginning to brew on the fringes of your range. The climate is stabilising, the megafauna are beginning to retreat or go extinct, and the pressure of increasing population is forcing people to spend more time in certain resource-rich areas. This subtle shift will eventually lead to an experiment that changes everything. The move from following the food to forcing the food to stay put. The next section, however, will delve into the profound internal life of these nomadic groups, the spiritual and aesthetic world they created on the walls of their deepest, darkest caves, the stunning art that served as a testament to their powerful minds. You've mastered the hunt, perfected the toolkit, and established a functioning mobile society. Now we must delve into the unseen world, the mind of the Upper Paleolithic person. You're not just a creature of survival, you're a creature of meaning, driven by a powerful impulse to create, to record, and to connect with forces beyond the visible horizon. This impulse finds its most breathtaking expression in the deep, dark sanctuaries of the caves. Imagine descending into the pitch-black heart of a cave system, the air thick and silent, broken only by the drip of water. You're carrying a simple lamp, perhaps a hollowed-out stone bowl filled with animal fat and a moss wick, which casts flickering, unstable light. You are not seeking shelter, you're seeking a canvas, and on the damp, cold walls of places like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain, you create a staggering legacy. The great cave paintings. These are not random doodles. They are magnificent dynamic murals, often placed in chambers deep inside the cave far from the entrance where you actually lived. This is your mainstream historical fact. Paleolithic cave art, dating back as far as 40,000 years ago, features detailed naturalistic depictions of animals, such as bison, horses, aurochs, and mammoths. painted using mineral pigments like red ochre and black charcoal, often placed in remote ritualistic chambers. The sheer skill involved is astonishing. You grind iron oxides to get the deep reds, manganese dioxide for the blacks, and mix them with animal fat or water to create paint. You apply it with moss, hairbrushes, or even by blowing pigment through a hollow bone tube, the prehistoric equivalent of an airbrush, to create stunning shading and effects. The artist often used the natural contours of the rock wall to give the painted animals a three-dimensional presence. A bulge in the stone becomes the powerful shoulder of a charging bison. The purpose of this art is one of the greatest open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of Paleolithic cave art was sympathetic magic to ensure hunting success, a teaching mechanism for initiates, a record of totemic or cosmological beliefs, or simply the result of shamanic trances and vision quests. Were you painting the animal to magically control it? Were you illustrating a story about the last successful hunt for the young members of the tribe? Or was the deep cave a sacred space, a doorway to the spirit world, where the act of painting was itself a ritual to communicate with the forces that governed life and death? The answer is likely all of the above, reflecting a deeply intertwined view of art, magic, and survival. But cave walls weren't your only canvas. While the men were perhaps primarily focused on the large animals of the hunt, your female relatives were creating a more personal, intimate form of art, the Venus figurines. These small portable sculptures, carved from ivory, bone, or soft stone, are found across a vast swathe of Eurasia. They typically depict a female form with exaggerated features, very large breasts, hips, and abdomen, often with little to no detail on the face or feet. This is your quirky tidbit. The Venus figurines, such as the famous Venus of Willendorf, are characterized by their exaggerated female sexual characteristics and relative portability, suggesting they may have served as powerful symbols related to fertility, motherhood, or possibly self-portraits emphasizing corpulence and health in a time of scarcity. These figurines are not representations of ideal beauty by your modern standards. They are representations of vitality and reproductive success. In a world defined by the constant threat of starvation and the high mortality rates of childbirth, the ability to bear and nurse a child was the greatest source of power and continuity. The exaggeration of these features suggests they were not intended to be portraits of specific women, but rather abstract symbols of the feminine principle, life, abundance, and the continuity of the lineage. Some theories even suggest they were used by women themselves, perhaps during pregnancy or childbirth, as a kind of fertility charm or instructional aid. Their size and portability link them to your mobile, nomadic lifestyle. They are personal items, carried across continents, a tangible link to the power of the female body. Beyond the paint and the carving, the very existence of this art speaks volumes about your mental capacity. It shows abstraction. You are able to represent a three-dimensional moving object on a two-dimensional surface. It shows symbolism. The image of a bison is not the bison itself, but a shared symbol representing the animal. It shows memory. You are painting animals you saw days or weeks ago, recalling their form and movement with astonishing accuracy. This capacity for symbolic thought and memory is the foundation of complex modern communication and cultural transmission. It's what allowed your ancestors to pass down detailed hunting knowledge, ethical guidelines, and ultimately, your spiritual worldview across generations. The cave, therefore, becomes a kind of primeval cathedral, a place set apart where the mundane world of daily life ends and the sacred world begins. The act of going into the deep cave itself was a rite of passage, a physically and psychologically demanding journey. The deep chambers are where the veil between the physical and the spiritual world was believed to be thinnest. It's the original retreat centre, a place to commune with the great spirits of the animals and the forces of the earth. The artistic impulse also extended to the portable objects of daily life. We see tools, like spear throwers, meticulously carved into the shape of animals. Harpoons are decorated. Ochre is used not only for painting walls, but also for personal adornment. Body paint was likely a powerful signal of status, group identity, or ritual readiness. The distinction between art and utility dissolves. Everything you make is both functional and beautiful. As you conclude your time in the Upper Paleolithic, having mastered the craft of survival and the art of representation, you are now poised for the greatest and final migration. The world is changing again. The Great Ice Age is beginning its slow, long retreat. freeing up new landscapes and changing sea levels. To the east, a frozen land bridge is emerging, connecting Asia to a whole new, utterly uninhabited continent. The call of the unknown, that deep restlessness we first noted in Homo erectus, is stirring again in your bones, driving you toward the ultimate act of pioneering. The next chapter will see you take that enormous leap across a frigid, narrow passage, becoming the first humans to set foot in the Americas. The final, great expanse of the Earth is calling, and you are positioned to answer it. The Ice Age, though retreating, has locked up enormous quantities of the planet's water in vast continental glaciers. This drop in sea level has exposed a landmass that has been submerged for most of human history. Beringia, a colossal, treeless land bridge stretching thousands of miles between Siberia and Alaska. You, a member of a hardy nomadic Homo sapiens group in Northeast Asia, are among the few who will undertake this last continental migration. You don't think of it as crossing an ocean or finding a new world. To you, it's simply following the animals. The herds of bison, mammoth, and ancient horse, your primary source of food, are drawn eastward by new pastures and retreating ice. You are tracking them, a continuous generations-long hunt across a landscape that is simultaneously harsh and abundant. This migration is your mainstream historical fact. The Americas were first populated by hunter-gatherer groups from Northeast Asia who crossed the Bering Strait-Bering land bridge, Beringia, into Alaska, likely sometime between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago following the movements of megafauna. The walk across Beringia was not a sprint, but a slow, arduous settlement of a new, massive territory. For generations, your ancestors may have lived on Beringia itself, an exposed landmass the size of a small country, isolated from the rest of the world by ice sheets to the east and the receding ocean to the west. It was a cold, dry, windswept grassland, a mammoth steppe, but it was habitable, providing the grasses needed to sustain the immense herds you relied on. The critical hurdle came after crossing Beringia, the two immense Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that covered much of North America. For a long time, these sheets were believed to have blocked any movement south, meaning the first successful entry into the heartland of the Americas could only happen during a brief period when an ice-free corridor opened up between them, perhaps around 13,000 years ago. This theory centered on the Clovis culture, the earliest widespread, distinct archaeological tradition in the Americas, defined by their unique, fluted projectile points. However, modern research and new archaeological discoveries have introduced a fascinating complexity, leading to one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the initial peopling of the Americas occurred solely via an ice-free inland corridor after 13,000 years ago, the Clovis first model, or if an earlier coastal migration route, where groups navigated along the exposed coastline south of the ice sheets, allowed for a much earlier arrival. Imagine the coastal theory. Instead of waiting for a gap in the ice, you and your group become maritime hunter-gatherers. You build simple, sturdy watercraft, perhaps skin boats like the Inuit kayaks, and navigate the Pacific coast. The coastal areas, even near the glaciers, would have been relatively rich in resources: kelp forests, shellfish, seals, and fish. This route would have been difficult and demanding, but it was opened much earlier than the inland corridor. Finds at sites like Monteverde in Chile, dating back over 14,500 years, and other pre-Clovis sites, suggest that the first humans were already far south before the ice-free corridor was fully navigable, lending strong support to the idea of this bold Pacific coastal express. Whether you trudge through a corridor or paddle down the coast, your arrival in the vast uninhabited continent was the end of human isolation. The New World presented a paradise of resources untouched by human hands. The megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats were abundant, numerous, and critically naive. They had not evolved alongside human hunters. They did not possess the ingrained fear of the tiny, clever primate with the stone-tipped spear that their old world relatives did. This initial abundance made for incredibly effective hunting, but it also sowed the seeds of a future crisis. The cultural marker of this initial wave of settlement, and the one that dominates the narrative, is the Clovis point. This is your quirky tidbit. The distinct, finely worked, flute-shaped Clovis projectile point is a unique piece of American Paleolithic technology, which may have been a highly effective, adaptable, and recognizable cultural marker enabling cooperation or trade among the first groups as they rapidly spread across the continent. The flute is a channel removed from the base of the point, which made it easier to securely haft onto a spear shaft or dart, a masterpiece of pressure flaking. Finding these points scattered across North America, from New Mexico to the Great Lakes, shows an astonishingly rapid colonization of a huge area, a testament to the effectiveness of their hunting techniques and the richness of the environment. This period, often called the Paleo-Indian era, was a time of dynamic movement and rapid adaptation. As the climate continued to warm, the great ice sheets finally retreated, profoundly changing the North American landscape. The massive megafauna began to disappear, a process known as the Quaternary extinction event. The coincidence of the arrival of the hyper-efficient human hunters and the rapid extinction of 70% of large mammals has led to the controversial overkill hypothesis, where human predation is seen as the primary driver of this mass extinction. However, climate change and the loss of the required steppe environment also played a critical role. Regardless of the exact cause, the end of the megafauna forced a dramatic shift in your way of life. The paradise was fading. You had to abandon the specialization on mammoth and mastodon and shift toward a much broader, more varied diet of smaller game, fish, birds, and crucially, a greater reliance on plant foods. This shift from big game hunting to broad-spectrum foraging in the Americas mirrored changes happening globally as the Ice Age ended. It necessitated new tools, new knowledge, and a closer relationship with the emerging forests and riverine environments. You have now fully colonized every major landmass on Earth, barring the extreme polar regions. The cycle of migration, adaptation, and innovation has culminated in the establishment of foundational populations across the planet. The vast, empty wilderness of the Americas is now your home. You have brought with you the accumulated knowledge of 1,000,000 years of human existence, the mastery of fire, the sophisticated toolkits, the deep spiritual drive, and the capacity for complex social organization. But this very success, the ability to exploit the environment so thoroughly, is about to precipitate the single most profound societal change in human history. As the world warms and stabilizes into the Holocene epoch, the sheer abundance of resources in certain areas, combined with the pressure of rising populations, will make the nomadic life less necessary and less efficient than the radical new experiment that is already being tried in the Near East. You are about to trade the uncertainty of the open range for the exhausting but rewarding commitment of the field. You are about to become a farmer, and that change will be irreversible. The great migrations are over. You stand on the threshold of a revolution far more profound than any toolkit upgrade or social restructuring that has come before. The nomadic life, which defined your species for millions of years, is about to be supplanted by the grueling, persistent, yet fundamentally stabilizing practice of agriculture. The world is warmer, the climate more predictable, and the megafauna that sustained your ancestors are dwindling. You're being nudged by environmental changes and pulled by population growth into a radical new experiment in subsistence. We focus now on the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of well-watered land in the Near East, encompassing modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. Here, the ancestral forms of the world's most critical cereal crops and domesticated animals thrive naturally. You observe that wild einkorn, wheat, and barley grow in vast, dense stands. You notice that the local wild sheep and goats are relatively docile and herdable. You also notice that your mobile hunter-gatherer existence, while flexible, is becoming less efficient as more people occupy the landscape. The shift isn't a single, blinding moment of revelation. It's a slow, generational process of intensification. You start by simply harvesting the wild grains more efficiently, perhaps using sickles made of flint blades hafted onto bone or wood. You store the surplus, allowing you to settle in one place for longer periods. Eventually you realize that if you scatter the largest seeds in the disturbed soil near your seasonal camp, you get an even larger harvest the next year. You're moving from simply gathering food to manipulating its growth cycle. This accidental intervention blossoms into intentional cultivation. This move to farming, the Neolithic Revolution, is your mainstream historical fact. Beginning around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, the independent development of agriculture, involving the domestication of plants, like wheat and barley, and animals, like goats and sheep, fundamentally transformed human society from mobile hunter-gatherer groups to sedentary farming communities. This transition is arguably the single most important economic shift in human history, leading directly to the invention of cities, writing, and, yes, taxes. The immediate consequences of settling down are mixed. You gain a massive, reliable increase in calorie production per unit of land, meaning you can support far greater population densities. This reliability is the great advantage. However, your life becomes harder in many ways. You work longer hours, tied to the relentless seasonal demands of planting, tending, and harvesting. Your diet becomes narrower, heavily reliant on a few carbohydrate-rich staples like wheat or rice, which leads to early signs of nutritional stress, like shorter stature and increased dental decay. Furthermore, living in close proximity to both your neighbours and your domesticated animals creates the perfect environment for diseases to jump from animals to humans, the first great epidemics of the settled life. Your daily life changes drastically. The light, portable tools of the Paleolithic are replaced by heavier, more durable equipment. You invent the hoe and the plough, pulled initially by humans, later by oxen, to prepare the ground. You need strong, heavy containers for storing grain, which drives the invention of pottery, a topic we'll explore shortly. And most importantly, the concept of property becomes paramount. When you are a nomadic hunter-gatherer, your wealth is the knowledge in your head and the things you can carry. When you are a farmer, your wealth is the land you cleared and the grain you stored. This fixed inheritable wealth creates the first significant social stratification. Certain families control the best land or accumulate the largest surpluses, leading to disparities in power and status. The egalitarian social structure of the hunter-gatherer band begins to fracture, giving way to hierarchy. The crucial open scholarly debate phrase about this transition highlights the mystery of why it happened. Historians still argue whether the Neolithic revolution was primarily driven by environmental necessity, such as post-Ice Age climate change reducing wild resources, or if it was a voluntary process sparked by demographic pressure, too many people needing too much food, or perhaps even a cultural and social mechanism for competitive feasting and demonstrating status. Did you have to farm, or did you choose to farm as a more reliable, if more tedious, path to prestige and a larger family? The consensus leans toward a complex interplay of demographic and climate pressures, making agriculture a more attractive or necessary option than continued foraging. The process of domestication itself is a fascinating quirk. This is your quirky tidbit. The early domestication of crops often resulted in a domestication syndrome, where humans inadvertently selected for traits that were poor for wild survival but excellent for cultivation, such as the non-shattering ear of wheat, which stays attached to the stalk for easier harvesting, and the docile temperament of animals. In the wild, wheat needs its head to shatter so seeds disperse. When you select the heads that don't shatter, you create a plant that is entirely dependent on you to survive and reproduce. You have created an agricultural prisoner, and in doing so, you have imprisoned yourself to the cycle of the seasons. Simultaneously, the domestication of animals provides essential protein, hides, and later power. Goats and sheep provide meat and milk. Pigs were quickly domesticated in Eurasia. The cow provides immense muscle power for ploughing and hauling, radically increasing the land area you can cultivate. The dog, which was domesticated much earlier during the Paleolithic, remains your loyal companion, now serving as a protector of your herds and a scavenger around your permanent settlements. The successful implementation of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent triggers a global pattern. Other major centres of domestication arise independently: rice and pigs in China, maize, beans and squash in Mesoamerica, and potatoes and llamas in the Andes. This suggests that the preconditions, a stable climate and high population density, were ripe across the world for this great change. As your small settlement swells into a village, the demands of the new life require more planning, more long-term coordination, and better methods of social control. This necessitates the development of more complex communal institutions. You need shared systems for managing water, irrigation, communal defence, and eventually a system for mediating disputes over land and stored grain. This complexity begins to push the social structure beyond the simple egalitarian band. We are moving from a village to something far grander and more complex, the proto-city. The great paradox of the Neolithic revolution is that you gave up the freedom of the hunter-gatherer for the stability of the farmer. You traded a varied diet and relatively easy work for a monotonous diet and back-breaking labour, but in return you gained the surplus that would eventually fund monumental architecture, intellectual pursuits, and the entire structure of civilization. You are tied to the land, rooted, and ready to face the intense social challenges that permanence brings. The next step is to examine what life was like in the very first places where this new density of human life coalesced. In the ancient, dusty birthplaces of urbanism. The seeds are sown, the harvests are reliable, and the restless mobility of your ancestors has given way to the deep, stabilizing commitment to the land. You have traded the open savanna for the crowded, dusty confines of a permanent settlement. This is where the profound consequences of the Neolithic Revolution become visible, coalescing not into simple villages, but into the first places that truly tested the limits of human cooperation and density, the proto-cities of the Near East. We are going to walk the ancient unpaved lanes of Jericho and Çatalhöyük. Your first stop is Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley. This site is a marvel of deep time, a tell, a mound of accumulated debris from continuous human occupation that has been continuously settled for nearly 11,000 years. Jericho is the oldest continuously inhabited settlement on Earth, and it's a living testament to the staying power of the agricultural choice. In its earliest Neolithic phase, known as the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, PPNA, Jericho was a significant settlement, notable for its surprisingly sophisticated architectural feature. This is your mainstream historical fact. The Neolithic settlement of Jericho, in its earliest phase, around 9000 BCE, constructed a massive stone wall and a prominent circular stone tower, predating the invention of pottery and signalling an early need for communal labour, defence, or perhaps flood control. Imagine the wall, a formidable structure, several metres high and thick, built of unworked stones, requiring thousands of hours of collective effort. And behind it, the Tower of Jericho, a round stone structure about 30 feet high with an internal staircase. This is monumental architecture, the earliest known example in the world, but why? This question brings us to one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the monumental wall and tower of Neolithic Jericho were built primarily for defensive purposes against rival groups, for protection against flash floods and erosion from the nearby mountains, or as a communal labour project intended to solidify nascent social hierarchy and community identity. The tower, in particular, may have had an astronomical or ritualistic function, perhaps used to track the solstices or to ritually bury the dead. The fact that the entire community could be mobilised for such a huge, complex project shows an unprecedented level of social organisation and centralised direction, hinting at the rise of early forms of leadership and authority. Someone had to tell everyone else where to put the stones, and that someone had a level of power your nomadic ancestors would never have recognised. Now let's move westward, across the Anatolian plateau, to a settlement that offers a starkly different but equally complex vision of early urbanism. Çatalhöyük, pronounced Çatalhöyük, flourishing around 7500 BCE. If Jericho was walled and centralised, Çatalhöyük was a dense, sprawling organic maze of interconnected dwellings. Imagine stepping into Çatalhöyük. There are no streets, no lanes, and no open squares. The houses, built of mud brick, are packed tightly together, literally sharing walls like cells in a honeycomb. This is your quirky tidbit. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük entered their homes through a hole in the roof, using ladders, meaning movement within the settlement was primarily across the rooftops, which served as the main thoroughfare, workspace, and social area. This is a society turned literally upside down, living on the ceiling of their homes. This architectural strategy provided an excellent defence against intruders and maximised interior space, but it also speaks to a very specific and highly integrated way of communal life. The interiors of these homes tell an astonishing story of ritual and art. Each house was a deeply symbolic, highly decorated space. The walls were plastered and painted with elaborate murals depicting hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and scenes involving vultures, perhaps symbolising death or ritual defleshing. More significantly, the inhabitants performed ritualistic burials beneath the floors of their homes. When a family member died, they were often defleshed, sometimes exposed to the elements or birds, perhaps suggested by the vulture paintings, and then carefully buried beneath the hearth or the sleeping platform, often with grave goods. The continuity of life and death in Çatalhöyük is palpable. You're quite literally sleeping on top of your ancestors, but despite this incredibly high population density, estimates run into the thousands, and the profound levels of artistic and ritual complexity, the evidence for clear social hierarchy is surprisingly thin. Unlike Jericho, there are no massive public buildings, no clear palaces or temples, and generally houses are of similar size, suggesting a society that managed to maintain a high degree of social equality, even with permanent settlement. This contrast leads us to ponder the different paths urbanization could take. Did the high density of Çatalhöyük force its inhabitants to maintain an internal peace and equality to prevent the entire interconnected structure from dissolving into conflict? Was their lack of street-level access and individual front doors a conscious way to de-emphasize individuality and promote a collective identity? The tight, interconnected nature of their living arrangements might have served as its own form of social control and defence. The two settlements, Jericho with its monumental wall and centralised labour, Çatalhöyük with its roof-based movement and decentralised social structure, represent two distinct responses to the challenges of the Neolithic Revolution. They demonstrate that the transition to permanent living did not follow a single blueprint. It created a variety of complex social and political forms, all driven by the simple necessity of managing stored food and larger populations. The fundamental change in the relationship with death is also crucial here. For the mobile hunter-gatherers, death meant leaving the body behind. For the settled inhabitants of Jericho and Çatalhöyük, the dead became a permanent, integrated part of the home and the community. Your ancestors, once buried under your floor, became a claim to the land, a potent symbol of lineage and inheritance. The dead anchor the living to the place. The challenge of these early proto-cities was immense. How do you feed thousands of people year-round? How do you manage sanitation? How do you resolve conflicts that, in a mobile band, could be solved by simply walking away? The sheer stress of density and monotony pushed your ancestors to innovate constantly, particularly in the domain of food storage. The necessity to manage surplus grain, to store the harvest through the hungry winter months and protect it from pests, moisture and thieves, was the ultimate driver of the next great technological step. Without effective storage, agriculture is impossible, and the city collapses. It demanded a container that was durable, affordable, and capable of being sealed. The invention that answered this call would not be made of stone or bone, but of mud and fire. We are about to witness the true birth of the container age, preparing for the next section where the invention of pottery will revolutionize food storage and population growth, linking the simple act of baking clay to the complex processes of early civilization. The ability to make a pot would turn out to be as significant as the ability to make a spear. You've anchored yourself to the land, built proto-cities like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, and faced the intense social pressures of permanent life. Your success hinges entirely on your ability to produce and manage a surplus of food, primarily grain. You've successfully engineered the wheat to remain on the stalk, but once harvested, where do you put it? Hiding it in pits or lining baskets with mud works for a time. But those methods are susceptible to moisture, pests, and fire. What you need is a durable, non-porous, sealable container that can be mass-produced. The answer lies in the simple marriage of clay and fire. The invention of pottery marks a decisive break from the Paleolithic world. Clay, easily available near riverbeds and settlements, is malleable when wet and becomes rock-hard and impervious to water when subjected to high heat. This is your mainstream historical fact. The invention of fired pottery during the Neolithic period revolutionized food storage, cooking and transport, allowing early farming communities to manage large surpluses and leading directly to population expansion and economic specialization. This invention, while seemingly simple, is a massive technological leap that requires mastery of pyrotechnology. You need to control fire with a precision never before required. It's not enough to have a campfire, you need a kiln, an enclosed space where you can reach sustained temperatures of over 500 degrees Celsius. Learning to regulate the heat, control the oxygen flow, and prevent the clay from cracking in the sudden temperature changes was a complex empirical science developed over generations. Imagine your early attempts. Clay pots crack, they explode, they melt. but eventually you perfect the technique. You temper the clay with grit, sand, or crushed shells to prevent shrinking. You coil the clay precisely, and you learn the signs of a successful firing. The finished product, a ceramic jar, is a revolutionary object. It can be sealed with a lid and mud, protecting your life-sustaining grain from vermin and damp. This guaranteed storage capacity fundamentally reduces the risk of starvation and provides a secure base for population growth. The impact of the pot wasn't limited to storage. It revolutionized cooking. Before pottery, cooking was limited to roasting meat over an open flame or stone boiling, dropping hot stones into a hide or basket filled with water. With the advent of a fireproof ceramic vessel, you can now place the pot directly over the flame. This allows for stewing, boiling and simmering, which brings enormous benefits. It makes tough grains and certain tubers more digestible. It allows you to extract maximum nutrients from bone broth, and it enables the creation of complex mixed dishes. The pot turns your kitchen into a centre of efficient calorie extraction. Furthermore, the pot facilitates infant feeding. It allows for the safe preparation and storage of soft foods and liquids, enabling earlier weaning and supplementary feeding of infants. This simple fact has a profound demographic impact. Hunter-gatherers often spaced their children far apart, 4 to 5 years, due to the necessity of carrying them while constantly moving and the biological effects of continuous nursing. Fixed settlements and pottery-aided weaning allow women to recover faster and have children more frequently, directly contributing to the population explosion that characterises the Neolithic period. The pot also drives economic specialisation. This is your quirky tidbit. The repetitive and highly skilled nature of coiling, shaping, decorating and firing ceramic vessels led to the emergence of the first professional artisans who did not participate directly in food production, freeing them from farming duties. Imagine the potter, a craftsman who, through specialised knowledge, creates valuable, tradable goods that are essential to every household. This specialisation leads to the first significant trade networks based on manufactured goods. A well-made pot from a skilled potter can be traded for grain from a successful farmer, creating an internal exchange economy within the settlement. The style and decoration of pottery also become powerful cultural markers. Every region, every group develops its own unique ceramic styles, from the painted wares of the Halaf culture to the impressed designs of the linear band pottery culture in Europe. These styles act as visual signals of group identity, allowing archaeologists thousands of years later to track the movement of peoples, the spread of ideas, and the extent of trade connections across the Near East and Europe. The simple pot tells a complex story of ancient boundaries and connections. This transition from mobile subsistence to settled, storage-based agriculture presents a philosophical dilemma that fuels one of the open, scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the invention and widespread use of pottery primarily accelerated the social changes already set in motion by agriculture, or if its capacity for mass food storage was the single most crucial factor that enabled the later development of social stratification and state formation. Did the pot make the city possible, or did the city demand the pot? It is clear that without a secure way to hold and manage the massive surpluses created by farming, the complex centralised structures that define civilization could never have materialised. The pot, in its silent utility, embodies the triumph and the trap of the Neolithic age. It provides security and enables population growth, but it also anchors you irrevocably to your spot on the map, forcing you to defend your stored wealth and manage the ensuing social complexity. The egalitarian ideals of the nomadic band are now impossible. The pot creates the concept of inheritable wealth, grain that can be passed down, which leads to the accumulation of power and the need for formalised rules, systems, and eventually bureaucracy. As your society becomes more stratified, complex, and populated, the demands for even greater technological solutions intensify. You have mastered fire to harden clay. The next logical step is to use that same mastery of heat to process the hardest and most valuable materials available: metals. The need for new tools to manage the growing population, to create better implements for farming, and inevitably to forge better weapons for defending the accumulated wealth, will drive you out of the Stone Age and into the age of metallurgy. The potter's kiln is the direct ancestor of the smelter, and the gentle curve of a ceramic jar is about to give way to the sharp, unforgiving edge of copper. You've mastered fire for cooking, and for hardening clay into pottery. The successful management of grain and population density in the early proto-cities like Jericho has created a new demand. Tools that are stronger, sharper, and more durable than anything you can make from stone, bone, or wood. The next great technological leap requires you to push your pyrotechnic mastery to its absolute limit, transforming common rock into lustrous, pliable metal. This marks the shift from the Neolithic, New Stone Age, to the Chalcolithic, Copper Stone Age, and then quickly into the Bronze Age. The initial discovery was likely accidental. Perhaps a potter noticed that certain green or blue-tinted stones, used to decorate a kiln or found near a particularly hot fire pit, yielded a strange, malleable residue, a gleaming droplet of pure copper. Copper is one of the few metals that can occur naturally in a relatively pure metallic state, and it's a beautiful, soft metal. Your ancestors quickly realised that this soft rock could be hammered into shapes without breaking. This process, known as cold hammering, precedes true smelting and allowed for the creation of simple ornaments and small tools like awls and hooks. The real revolution, however, is the controlled use of extreme heat to extract the metal from its ore, the process of smelting. This requires temperatures far higher than those used for pottery, often exceeding 1085 degrees Celsius. Developing a kiln or furnace capable of reaching and maintaining this heat required sophisticated air circulation, often achieved with bellows, specialised knowledge of fuel sources, and the identification of the correct copper ore, like malachite. This discovery of smelting is your mainstream historical fact. The intentional extraction of copper metal from its ore through high-heat smelting, beginning around 5000 BCE in regions like Anatolia and the Balkans, marked humanity's transition into the Metal Ages, leading to the production of durable tools, weapons, and prestige objects. The discovery of smelting was not just a material change, it was an intellectual one. You had unlocked the power to chemically transform the earth, mastering an element on a fundamental level. Copper itself, while novel and shiny, has a major drawback. It's soft. A copper axe will lose its edge or bend quickly against hard stone or wood. It was primarily used for status objects, jewellery, and small specialised implements. Copper objects became instant prestige goods. If you owned a polished copper axe or a delicate copper pin, you were broadcasting your status as someone with access to rare resources and the specialised knowledge needed to work them. This accelerates the social stratification already underway in the agricultural settlements. The people who control the copper trade and the smelting technology begin to accumulate immense power and wealth. The ultimate game changer, however, was the accidental or deliberate mixing of copper with another, less common metal, tin. When copper and tin are melted together in the correct proportion, usually around 10% tin, the resulting alloy, bronze, is dramatically harder, more durable, and has a lower melting point, making it excellent for casting in moulds. The search for tin, a resource often located far from copper deposits, drove the creation of the first extensive long-distance trade networks. This need for tin brings us to one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the Bronze Age's expansion of trade and technology was primarily fueled by the military advantages of bronze weaponry, or if the economic and prestige benefits of bronze tools for craft specialisation were the initial and more widespread catalyst for its adoption across distant regions. Was it driven by the need for a better sword or a better chisel? Regardless, the search for tin connected the entire Near East and eventually Europe. Someone in Mesopotamia might be using tin mined hundreds of miles away in the mountains of modern-day Turkey, or even further afield. The ability to cast bronze in standardised, reusable moulds revolutionised manufacturing. You could now produce identical, complex objects, axes, adzes, chisels, and critically swords and spearheads, with far greater efficiency than was possible with time-consuming stone flaking. Bronze weapons were vastly superior to their stone counterparts, giving the users an immediate and decisive advantage in warfare. This, combined with the concentration of wealth needed to acquire both copper and tin, reinforced the power of the new ruling elites. The person with the best access to bronze was now the best equipped soldier and the most powerful ruler. The development of metalworking also fostered new, essential forms of specialisation. Smelting required miners to find the ore, metallurgists to understand the chemical process, casters to create the moulds, and finishers to polish the final product. The knowledge was complex and often guarded. further separating these specialised workers from the common farmer and embedding their value within the burgeoning social hierarchy. The metallurgist becomes a figure of near-magical status, turning stone into shiny, functional metal. This new level of craft knowledge and its application in warfare leads us to a quirky tidbit. The very first metal weapons often mirrored the designs of older, familiar stone and bone weapons, such as flanged axes and simple daggers. However, the introduction of bronze eventually led to entirely new weapon designs, most notably the sword, a long single-piece cutting weapon that could not be reliably made from any previous material, fundamentally changing the nature of close-quarters combat. The sword is the signature weapon of the Bronze Age, signalling a shift from mass combat with projectiles to elite duels and organised fighting by specialist warriors. The Bronze Age wasn't just about tools and weapons, it was about global connection. The trade networks created to move copper, tin and finished bronze goods also became conduits for the exchange of culture, ideas and religious beliefs. Chariots, pottery styles, burial practices, and even specific myths travelled across these same routes. The world was shrinking, interconnected by the relentless demand for metal. However, relying on these fragile, far-flung supply chains made the Bronze Age civilizations inherently vulnerable. If one key tin source was cut off, the entire supply of a region's most critical strategic resource could dry up, leading to economic and military collapse. As the Bronze Age advances, the need to manage these complex supply chains, record inventory, track labourers, and coordinate military efforts becomes overwhelming. The sheer volume of information being generated, how much grain is stored, how much tin was received, how many labourers are owed payment, can no longer be entrusted to memory or simple tally sticks. The demands of commerce and bureaucracy, driven by agricultural surplus and metal trade, are about to force your ancestors into the next major cognitive leap, the invention of a system to permanently and universally record information. The clay tablet, used for centuries to make pottery, is about to become the world's first piece of paper. The foundation for history itself is about to be poured. The Bronze Age is in full swing. You have organised labour to work the fields, managed the specialised skills of the potter and the metallurgist, and established trade routes spanning hundreds of miles to secure tin. Your agricultural settlements have swelled into complex proto-cities, and this high level of organisation has created a new, urgent problem: data management. How do you accurately track the 10,000 bushels of barley stored in the communal granary? How do you ensure that the smith who made the bronze axes is paid the correct amount of grain? How do you record the contract for the shipment of 50 pounds of tin from a distant trading post? Your memory, however prodigious, is no longer sufficient. Tally sticks and simple clay tokens are too limited for the nuances of commerce and bureaucracy. The very complexity you have engineered demands a systematic, external means of recording information. The time is ripe for the invention of writing. We turn our attention to Mesopotamia, specifically the city of Uruk in Sumer, modern-day Iraq, around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE. This is the heartland of agricultural surplus and urban density, and it is here that the scribes of temple and palace administrations first scratched systematic symbols into clay tablets. This is your mainstream historical fact. Writing was invented independently in several parts of the world, but the earliest fully developed script is Sumerian cuneiform, which originated in Mesopotamia as a system for administrative record keeping, initially tracking economic transactions such as grain inventories and labour contracts. The very first texts were not epic poems or declarations of law. They were, quite simply, receipts and ledgers. They were born not out of a desire for literature, but out of the grinding logistical necessity of managing a massive, complex urban economy. Your first written words were not a philosophical inquiry, they were an account sheet. You might say that bureaucracy is the mother of all invention. The system began with simple pictograms, drawings of the objects they represented. A drawing of a barley head meant barley. A drawing of an ox head meant ox. But this system quickly proved limited. How do you draw abstract concepts like debt, payment, or justice? The scribes made the crucial intellectual leap to phonetic writing. They began to use the pictograms not just for the object itself, but for the sound of the word. For example, a picture of an arrow might be used to represent the sound of the word tie, which, in Sumerian, also meant life. As the symbols evolved and were pushed into soft clay using a reed stylus, they morphed from curvy drawings into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform, from the Latin cunus meaning wedge. Imagine a scribe sitting on a rush mat in a bustling temple courtyard, pressing the corner of a reed into a small damp clay tablet. The resulting impression is a triangle, sharp and precise. He can press 1,000 of these wedges into a dense script, recording the details of a transaction, a prayer, or a royal decree. The clay tablet, once inscribed, is either left to dry or intentionally fired in a kiln, transforming a temporary record into an archival document, a permanent piece of history. This technology created a new, immensely powerful class, the scribes. Learning cuneiform was a long, arduous process, requiring mastery of hundreds of signs. This specialization made scribes essential gatekeepers of knowledge and power. They were the original administrators, accountants, and historians, occupying a privileged position in the social hierarchy, often alongside the priests and the ruling class. If you couldn't read and write, you couldn't check the accuracy of the king's tax records or the temple's grain tally. The invention of writing introduces a major open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the primary effect of early writing systems like cuneiform was the creation of a centralized, elite-dominated bureaucratic control system, or if it fundamentally changed human cognition by enabling more complex abstract thought and the non-biological preservation of collective memory. Did writing simply make powerful people more powerful by giving them a better tool for control, or did it make all of humanity smarter by allowing complex thought to escape the bounds of individual memory? The consensus is that it did both, enabling the systematic organisation of a large populations while also serving as a revolutionary tool for abstract philosophy and science. Writing was also a technology of cultural expansion. As Sumerian city-states rose to prominence, their cuneiform system was adopted, adapted, and refined by succeeding empires and cultures, including the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Hittites. It became the lingua franca of diplomacy and trade across the Near East, a complex but versatile script used to write dozens of different languages. The earliest surviving examples of non-administrative writing offer a fascinating glimpse into the ancient mind. While the majority of tablets concern grain or oil, a small number deal with topics like early legal codes, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi, though written centuries after cuneiform's invention, early scientific observations, and crucially, literature. This is your quirky tidbit. Among the earliest known literary works committed to writing are the myths and epic tales of Sumer, most famously the Epic of Gilgamesh, a narrative that explores universal themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for eternal life. This epic, recorded on clay tablets, is older than the Bible, older than Homer, and it shows that almost immediately after solving the problem of how to record a receipt, your ancestors turned their attention to the eternal questions of human existence. With writing, you're no longer relying on oral tradition, a fragile system where history is only as good as the last person who told the story. You have created history itself. You can now communicate across vast spans of space and time. A king can issue a decree that will be followed in a distant province, and a future scholar, thousands of years later, can read the worries of an ancient farmer about his debts. The final result of agriculture, metallurgy, and writing is the formation of the state. The administrative tools provided by writing allowed the most successful proto-cities to scale up their control, coordinate large-scale public works, like massive irrigation canals, and effectively manage armies. This capability enabled the most dynamic settlements to transition from mere city-states, independent, small urban centres, to the first true territorial kingdoms and empires. The stage is set for the consolidation of power. Writing has provided the blueprint for command and control. The surplus wealth from agriculture provides the resources. Bronze provides the military means. The small independent city-states of Sumer are about to be swallowed by larger, more ambitious political entities. We are moving from the humble ledger to the grand pronouncements of the first kings, establishing a new and much larger scale of political organisation. The walls of Uruk are strong, but the ambition of its rulers, amplified by the power of the written word, will soon be boundless. The script is written, the ledgers are balanced, and the clay tablets now testify to the wealth stored in your granaries and the might of your bronze weaponry. The small, independent city-states of Sumer, like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, were the cradle of this revolution, each an urban island surrounded by its irrigated fields, governed by its own patron deity and ruling dynasty. But this independence, built on agricultural surplus and specialised labour, also contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The very success of the city-state made it a ripe target, and the efficiency of writing allowed a new, ambitious form of political organisation to emerge, the territorial kingdom and eventually the empire. Imagine the transition. You are a farmer working the irrigated land outside the massive mud brick walls of your city-state. For generations, you have paid tribute to the local En, the high priest or lord, who manages the temple stores, coordinates the harvest and organises the communal defence. But now you hear rumours of a powerful ruler from a neighbouring city, perhaps Akkad, who has not only conquered his immediate neighbours, but has imposed his rule over a vast swathe of territory, replacing local autonomy with centralised control. This is the Great Shift, the move from the small, self-contained, religiously focused city-state to a geographically sprawling, militarily enforced political entity. This transformation culminates with Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE, who is credited with creating the world's first true empire. This is your mainstream historical fact. Sargon of Akkad established the Akkadian Empire, the first major historical example of a territorial state that unified previously independent city-states under a centralised dynastic ruler, setting the precedent for subsequent empires in Mesopotamia and beyond. Sargon achieved this through a combination of military innovation and sophisticated administration, which, as we discussed, was only possible due to writing. He created a standing army, not just a militia called up during wartime, loyal directly to him. His soldiers, equipped with bronze weapons and disciplined by constant training, overwhelmed the citizen armies of the fragmented Sumerian city-states. Once conquered, Sargon's administration faced the unprecedented challenge of ruling diverse populations across vast distances. How do you govern people who speak different languages, worship different local gods, and have different customary laws? The answer was centralisation. Sargon appointed his own governors to rule the conquered cities, ensuring loyalty and the consistent collection of taxes, usually in the form of grain, silver, or labour. The cuneiform script, originally used to track grain in Uruk, became the language of imperial command and control, used to standardise laws and issue edicts across the empire. The consolidation of power in the hands of the king profoundly changed the social contract. In the city-state, the temple, the institution of the gods, often held the primary economic and political power. In the empire, the palace, the institution of the king, became supreme. The king was no longer just a servant of the city's god. He often claimed divine sanction or even outright divinity, legitimising his conquests and his absolute authority. This political shift drove intense architectural and urban development. The resources of the entire region could now be marshalled for massive public works, not just local irrigation ditches, but immense region-spanning canal systems that dramatically increased agricultural yields. The construction of massive ziggurats, stepped temple towers, and royal palaces advertised the king's piety and power, physically reinforcing the hierarchy. Imagine the sense of awe and submission a farmer would feel seeing a towering ziggurat dedicated to the king's patron deity, built with his own tax grain. This need to constantly consolidate and manage power leads us to a quirky tidbit. The Akkadian Empire introduced standardized measures and weights across its territory, a crucial administrative innovation that facilitated inter-regional trade, ensured fair taxation, and established a common economic language across disparate city-states. Before Sargon, every city-state likely had its own way of measuring a bushel of grain or a shekel of silver. Sargon's standardization eliminated fraud and friction, turning the empire into a single, massive economic unit. This boring-sounding administrative reform was arguably as important as his army in holding the empire together. However, the nature of empire is inherently unstable. Territorial empires are held together by military might and administrative efficiency, both of which are constantly under threat. A major open scholarly debate phrase focuses on the fragility of these early megastates. Historians still argue whether the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and subsequent similar Bronze Age kingdoms was primarily caused by internal factors, such as administrative overreach and popular revolts, or by external pressures, most notably sustained drought and climate change, leading to widespread famine and the invasion of semi-nomadic groups. The evidence suggests that around 2200 BCE, a prolonged severe drought hit Mesopotamia, crippling the agricultural system the empire depended upon. The resulting famine weakened Sargon's successors, making them vulnerable to both internal dissent and external pressure from the Gutian people invading from the nearby Zagros Mountains. The complex web of empire, once broken, shattered back into its constituent city-states. The Akkadian model, a charismatic military ruler consolidating independent city-states into a large, centralized territorial state, became the template for future regional powers. After the Akkadian collapse, various empires rose and fell. The third dynasty of Ur, the old Babylonian empire under Hammurabi, who created one of the most complete early legal codes, and later the powerful empires of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The lesson was learned. Complexity and scale, made possible by agriculture and writing, were necessary for survival, but they came with the inherent risk of spectacular, widespread collapse. You, the ancestor, have now witnessed the full arc of civilization's earliest form, from the egalitarian hunter-gatherer band to the hierarchical city-state, and finally to the vast, centralized kingdom. This large-scale political organization provided periods of unprecedented security, large-scale cooperation and stability, allowing for further leaps in science, law and engineering. But it also introduced concepts of total war, large-scale servitude, and the crushing weight of imperial taxation. The power of these Bronze Age kingdoms was built on a foundation of bronze, a strategic material dependent on complex, often fragile trade routes for its tin supply. This inherent vulnerability would eventually contribute to a massive regional catastrophe known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread destruction, migration, and the near-total cessation of international trade around 1200 BCE. This collapse created a vacuum. When the great centralized powers vanished, the entire infrastructure of the Bronze Age, the palace bureaucracies, the writing systems, the trade networks, broke down. The world plunged into a dark age. But out of this darkness, a new, more common and more disruptive metal would emerge, fueling the next great age of human history and changing the distribution of power forever. The age of the expensive elite alloy is about to give way to the age of the democratic metal, iron. The great Bronze Age empires, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the New Kingdom Egyptians, have entered a period of crisis, marked by widespread destruction, famine, and population movement around 1200 BCE. The complex brittle trade networks that supplied the essential tin for bronze production have been severed, causing the collapse of the centralized palace economies and plunging much of the Near East and the Aegean into a dark age. The world needs a new strategic metal, one that's not dependent on fragile long-distance supply chains. The answer is iron. While iron smelting was known earlier, small, rare, decorative iron objects were found even in Egyptian tombs. It was incredibly difficult to master. Iron requires far higher temperatures than copper, and the raw material, iron ore, is much harder to process. Unlike copper, which flows molten from the ore, early iron smelting produces a spongy mass called bloom, which must be repeatedly hammered while hot, a process called forging, to drive out the impurities. This process makes the finished metal exceptionally tough, but the technical barrier to entry was high. However, necessity breeds innovation. With the collapse of the tin trade, the scattered communities were forced to look at resources close to home. Iron ore is found almost everywhere, in far greater abundance than copper or tin, often near the surface. The widespread accessibility of the raw material is your mainstream historical fact. The Iron Age, which succeeded the Bronze Age after circa 1200 BCE in the Near East and later in Europe, was defined by the widespread adoption of iron and eventually steel, a metal that was less costly and far more common than bronze, leading to a profound shift in military and economic power. The immediate effect of this transition was decentralization. Bronze was the metal of the elite. The expense of securing tin and the control over the casting process meant that bronze weaponry and tools were the sole possession of kings, aristocrats, and specialized warriors. Iron, conversely, was the metal of the common man. Once the difficult process was understood, any community with access to iron ore and a sturdy furnace could produce iron tools. This meant that the farmer could now afford an iron ploughshare to break harder ground and increase his yield, and the common soldier could be equipped with an iron sword and helmet. Imagine the agricultural revolution this sparked. An iron ploughshare is dramatically more effective than a wooden one, or even a simple bronze one. It cuts deeper, turning more soil, and allows for the cultivation of heavier, more fertile soils that were previously inaccessible. This increase in agricultural output helps to pull communities out of the post-collapse famine and enables a rebound in population. The common farmer, equipped with iron tools, became more productive, further eroding the power dynamics based on exclusive elite control of technology. This democratization of the metal supply led to significant military changes, which is a subject of one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the shift to iron weaponry during the early Iron Age conferred a significant military advantage over bronze, which was technically superior in its best form, or if its main impact was logistical, enabling large armies of common soldiers to be armed consistently and affordably. While a high-quality, high-tin bronze sword could be sharper and more beautiful than a simple wrought iron blade, the ability to equip 1,000 soldiers with serviceable iron spears was a logistical and strategic advantage that a king built on the copper-tin supply chain simply could not match. Iron was cheap, abundant, and could be mass-produced, making large standing armies sustainable. The key to iron's eventual supremacy, however, was the discovery of steel. Early wrought iron was relatively soft. The breakthrough was the accidental or deliberate discovery that if the wrought iron was heated while in contact with charcoal carbon, the surface of the metal would absorb the carbon, creating a thin, incredibly hard layer of carbon steel. This process, known as carburization, could be further refined with quenching and tempering, allowing the smith to create blades that were both hard, to keep a sharp edge, and tough, to resist shattering. The master smith became an essential figure in Iron Age society, often shrouded in a mystique born of his control over fire and metal. He knew the precise mix of heat, hammering, and quenching required to transform a piece of ugly, common ore into a magnificent ringing sword. This metallurgical complexity leads to a quirky tidbit. The Celts, or early Iron Age peoples of Central and Western Europe, became renowned throughout the ancient world for the quality and distinctive flexibility of their iron swords, which were so well made that they were often sought after by the Roman legions themselves. While early iron in the Near East was often brittle, the European smiths developed sophisticated forging and heat-treating techniques that allowed them to create weapons of exceptional quality, demonstrating that the mastery of iron was not a single discovery, but a continuous process of refinement and specialization that spread across the continent. The ultimate impact of the Iron Age was the creation of a world less dominated by centralized palace economies and more defined by regional powers and tribal chiefdoms. New powers emerged, unburdened by the collapse of the Bronze Age system. In the Near East, the Assyrian and later the Neo-Babylonian empires exploited iron technology to sustain their massive conquering armies. In the West, the rise of the Greek city-states, and eventually the Roman Republic, would be utterly dependent on the ability to equip their citizen soldiers with affordable iron tools and weapons. The Iron Age established a new, sustainable baseline for human technology that would endure for over 2 millennia. It put powerful tools in the hands of the many, accelerating the pace of agriculture, construction, and warfare. The centralized, palace-focused control of the Bronze Age was permanently broken. Wealth and power were still concentrated, but they were no longer solely dependent on the fragility of a single strategic resource like tin. As the political map of the Near East stabilizes under these new, iron-wielding empires, and as iron technology begins to seep into Europe and across Asia, the focus shifts back to connection. The new, abundant resources of the Iron Age fuel a massive increase in trade and intercultural contact. The new political entities need to move goods, armies, and ideas. The next section will see the ancient trails of the copper and tin merchants coalesce into major sustained routes of global commerce, leading to an unprecedented exchange of goods and, more importantly, ideas. The world is about to truly connect. The Iron Age has decentralized the means of production and equipped the common person with better tools, leading to a rebound in population and productivity following the Bronze Age collapse. The scattered chiefdoms and new empires, now armed with abundant iron, need to communicate, cooperate, and most importantly trade. The localized exchange networks of the Bronze Age, which primarily dealt in elite goods like tin and amber, now coalesce into major sustained conduits of global commerce. The first true proto-Silk Roads. You're living in a world that is rapidly becoming interconnected, a tapestry woven with camel caravans, sturdy ships and foot traffic. The inherent stability of Iron Age production, fueled by widely available iron ore, supports far more resilient trade than the fragile tin routes of the previous era. This expansion of sustained, large-scale commerce is your mainstream historical fact. The Iron Age saw the formalization of extensive long-distance trade routes, connecting civilizations from the Mediterranean to East Asia, facilitating not only the exchange of goods like spices, textiles and metals, but also the transmission of technologies, religious beliefs and artistic styles. Imagine the sheer audacity of these early journeys. A merchant in Phoenicia or Greece may never see the source of the silk that passes through their hands, and a Chinese courtier may never witness the myrrh trees of Arabia. Yet, the goods move, passed from one intermediary to the next, often travelling for years between producer and final consumer. This movement is powered by a shared, growing trust in the concept of value and reciprocity, the deep-seated human imperative to exchange what you have for what you lack. The trade routes themselves were diverse, exploiting geography where possible. You see the establishment of the incense route, which snaked through Arabia, bringing precious frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious rites and perfumes, from the southern Arabian Peninsula up to the wealthy Mediterranean ports. Simultaneously, the burgeoning networks across Central Asia began to form the skeletal structure of what would later become the full-fledged Silk Road, driven by the unique allure of Chinese silk. And of course, the Mediterranean Sea itself became a watery highway, dominated by seafaring peoples like the Phoenicians, Greeks, and later the Romans, who used their agile ships to connect North Africa, southern Europe, and the Near East. The impact of these routes goes far beyond economics. They are the arteries of cultural exchange. A new style of pottery decoration might travel from Greece to Italy. An administrative technique developed in Assyria might find its way to Egypt. And, crucially, fundamental technologies are diffused. The alphabet, a simpler and more efficient writing system developed by the Phoenicians, is a perfect example. Designed for the needs of maritime trade, its simplicity allowed it to be adopted by the Greeks, who refined it and passed it to the Romans, creating the basis for most Western scripts. The need for simple, quick record-keeping by travelling merchants proved to be a more powerful engine for writing reform than the complex bureaucracies of the temple scribes. This profound mixing of people, goods, and ideas leads us to a quirky tidbit. The presence of Greek-style artistic motifs, such as winged cherubs and Hercules-like figures, in Buddhist art found deep in Central Asia, is a vivid example of the cultural fusion resulting from the Proto-Silk Road trade, illustrating how religious iconography and mythology were constantly reshaped by foreign contact, as Hellenistic culture, spread by the armies and merchants of Alexander the Great and his successors, met the rising influence of Buddhism moving out of India. The two streams merged. The merchant was often the original missionary, carrying not just goods, but the stories, philosophies, and deities of their homeland. The trade routes also became channels for the movement of people, and, inevitably, disease. While the full, devastating impact of the great pandemics would come later, the initial contact between widely separated populations exposed them to novel pathogens against which they had no immunity. A merchant carrying grain or cloth from a distant land was unknowingly carrying a biological passenger, a virus or bacterium, that could lay waste to an entire city. These early trade routes were the original crucible for the co-evolution of human populations and infectious diseases. The essential contradiction of this interconnected world forms the heart of one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the primary result of the Iron Age trade routes was the creation of a stable, economically interdependent world system that minimized conflict by requiring mutual exchange, or if the control and taxation of these routes ultimately fueled greater interstate conflict and imperial expansion. Was trade a path to peace, through mutual benefit, or a source of incessant wars aimed at capturing the lucrative choke points, the harbour, the desert oasis, the mountain pass, that controlled the flow of wealth? Empires like the Assyrians and the later Persians certainly understood that controlling the flow of gold and goods was as important as controlling the fields of grain, and their military campaigns often targeted strategic trade centres. This global connectivity began to feed the intellectual ferment happening in many of these civilizations. Philosophers, thinkers, and prophets, exposed to the contrasting worldviews and ethical systems carried along the trade routes, began to formulate universal ideas. If you travel from Greece to Persia to India, you realize that people are fundamentally similar, asking the same fundamental questions about morality, suffering, and the nature of the divine. This confluence of worldviews, facilitated by the merchant, set the stage for one of the most profound shifts in human consciousness: the move from localized, polytheistic religion to universal, ethical monotheism. The sheer volume of wealth generated by these trade routes also provided the resources necessary for a massive expansion of population and the construction of monumental centres of culture and learning. The temples, the libraries, and the forums of the ancient world were built on the backs of successful harvests and taxed commerce. The philosophical and religious currents that arose during this era, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and the revolutionary development of monotheism, were themselves globalized phenomena, often spreading faster along the roads and sea lanes than any army or artifact. As the political and economic systems stabilize in this interconnected Iron Age, a powerful intellectual and spiritual movement is emerging. The localized gods of the Bronze Age tied to a single city or river are proving insufficient for the needs of cosmopolitan empires that stretch across continents and encompass dozens of different cultures. The trade routes brought the world together physically. The next great leap is to find a spiritual system capable of unifying it. The Iron Age trade routes have stitched the ancient world together, exposing people from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean to the fact that their neighbours worship different gods, follow different myths, and adhere to different moral codes. This cosmopolitan environment, fueled by widespread contact and an increase in literacy, sparks a profound re-evaluation of the divine. The localized polytheism that served the small Bronze Age city-state is proving inadequate for the ethical and political needs of vast interconnected empires. The spirit of the age demands a universal creed, a moral system that applies to all people, not just one tribe or city. This intellectual ferment, occurring roughly between 800 and 200 BCE, is sometimes called the Axial Age, a time when the great world religions and philosophical traditions emerged simultaneously across Eurasia. In the old system, your spiritual life was localized and pragmatic. You appeased the storm god to ensure rain for your crops, you venerated the river god for safe passage, and you honored the city goddess for protection. Religion was a transactional system focused on maintaining the immediate physical well-being of the community. This polytheistic structure, with its elaborate pantheons of human-like gods, wrathful, loving, jealous, and often quarrelling, is your mainstream historical fact. Ancient polytheistic systems, such as the Greek and Mesopotamian pantheons, featured multiple deities with specific domains and human-like personalities, with religious practice largely focused on ritual sacrifice and appeasement to secure prosperity and protection for the local community. However, as empires expand, carrying peoples far from their ancestral rivers and mountains, these geographically tied gods begin to lose their relevance. A Mesopotamian merchant travelling to Egypt needs a system that makes sense in a foreign land. A powerful king ruling over dozens of different peoples needs a unifying ideology that transcends tribal loyalties. This pressure drives the search for a single, overarching principle or deity. Across the trade routes, thinkers begin to ask profound questions. What is the underlying reality of the cosmos? Why do humans suffer? How should one live an ethical life? In Greece, thinkers like Socrates and Plato begin to use reason to explore ethics and the nature of reality, de-emphasizing the mythical stories of the Olympian gods. In India, the philosophical traditions of the Upanishads and the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism offer radical new paths based on introspection, karma, and the release from suffering. In China, Confucianism provides a comprehensive ethical and political framework based on social harmony and virtuous conduct, while Taoism seeks balance with the natural flow of the universe. All these new systems share a common characteristic: a move toward universalism and a deep focus on ethical behaviour as the path to salvation or enlightenment. but the most radical spiritual shift came in the form of monotheism. While many polytheistic cultures had a chief deity, the idea of a single god who is the only god, universal, transcendent, and possessing absolute moral authority, was revolutionary. We look to the small kingdom of Judah in the Levant, a crossroads perpetually caught between the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Here, the covenantal tradition of Yahweh evolved into the uncompromising singular worship that defined early Judaism. This shift introduces a fascinating intellectual aspect, which forms one of the great open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the transition to monotheism was an inevitable result of philosophical evolution towards abstraction and universal ethics, or if it was a highly contingent development driven by political and social crises, such as the exile of the Israelites to Babylon, which forced a unique commitment to an omnipresent, portable, and non-local deity. Was the Jewish God discovered through thought, or forged in the crucible of national disaster? The need for a God who could travel with the people and exist outside of any physical temple or land was a powerful ideological tool for maintaining cultural identity under foreign rule. This non-geographical God was perfectly suited for the mobile, interconnected world of the Iron Age. The greatest initial challenge to this concept was not philosophical, but political, which provides a quirky tidbit. The earliest known, though temporary, attempt at state-enforced monotheism occurred centuries earlier in Egypt, when the pharaoh Akhenaten, circa 1353 BCE, briefly commanded the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, abandoning the ancient Egyptian pantheon. However, this radical change was violently reversed immediately after his death, demonstrating the deep-seated resistance to such a dramatic religious upheaval. This failed Egyptian experiment highlights just how politically dangerous and culturally disruptive the concept of a singular god was, forcing your ancestors to discard millennia of traditional practice and upend the very foundation of their cosmos. The ultimate significance of the monotheistic tradition that emerged from the Near East, Judaism, and later its spiritual descendants Christianity and Islam, lies in its ethical universalism. Unlike the old transactional religions, which simply asked for sacrifice in exchange for protection, these new systems demanded righteous conduct towards all people. The concept of a single creator god meant that all humans were fundamentally connected and subject to the same divine law. This provided a powerful universal ethical blueprint that could hold together disparate populations within an empire or a worldwide religious community. The trade routes, therefore, acted as a spiritual incubator. They brought the diverse beliefs into conflict and comparison, forcing them to become more abstract, more ethical, and more universal to compete for adherence. The result was the intellectual foundation that would define the next millennia of human civilization. The questions asked by the philosophers of the axial age about purpose, morality, and justice are, in essence, the same questions you ask yourself today. You have now traced the full path of human development, from the first chipped stone to the complex written legal codes of empires, and from the fearful appeasement of local gods to the universal demands of ethical monotheism. However, all these achievements, the walls, the weapons, the wisdom, are subject to a final inevitable reality. No civilization is eternal. The massive scale and complex interdependence of the ancient world carried an inherent vulnerability. The end of our journey will examine the common patterns that bring these grand structures to ruin, paving the way for the next iteration of human society. You have witnessed the birth of humanity, the mastery of fire, the spread of agriculture, the invention of writing, and the rise of universal moral systems. You've seen the world expand from a small band of nomadic scavengers to vast, interconnected empires held together by bronze, iron, and the power of the written word. Yet, one relentless constant remains. All complex human societies are ultimately fragile. No wall is high enough, no army is strong enough, and no bureaucracy is efficient enough to stave off the final, inevitable cycle of collapse and renewal. The final chapter of our pre-classical journey explores this common pattern, the spectacular unmaking of ancient worlds that clears the ground for a new beginning. We are not talking about simple decline. We are talking about system collapse, a rapid, multifaceted failure that affects political, economic, and cultural infrastructure across an entire region. The most vivid example we've already touched upon is the Late Bronze Age collapse, circa 1200 BCE, This is your mainstream historical fact. The Late Bronze Age collapse represents a major historical example of system collapse, characterized by widespread simultaneous destruction of major urban centers, the disruption of vast trade networks, the disappearance of centralized palace economies, and the sudden cessation of literacy across the Near East and the Aegean. Imagine the world you built shattering around you. The sophisticated palace economies that managed the bronze trade and maintained the irrigation systems vanished. The centralized administrative system, so dependent on specialist scribes and complex record-keeping, broke down. The great royal cities, from Mycenae to Ugarit, were violently destroyed or abandoned. The cause of this massive synchronous failure is one of the most compelling open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue whether the Late Bronze Age collapse was triggered primarily by a single environmental disaster, such as a prolonged drought causing system-wide famine, or if it was the result of a perfect storm caused by internal factors like peasant revolt and endemic warfare, exacerbated by external pressure from the mysterious maritime sea peoples. The truth, as always, is a complex blend. The great empires were vast and brittle. A significant drought lasting decades could have crippled the agricultural base, leading to famine. Famine would have spurred internal revolt among the overtaxed populace and forced desperate migrations, destabilizing the entire region. Into this chaos likely arrived external groups, the Sea Peoples, whose identity remains elusive, but whose sudden, destructive appearance is recorded in Egyptian texts. They were a final military straw that broke the camel's back. When the system collapsed, the highly specialized top-heavy palace structure dissolved, resulting in centuries of a dark age where literacy vanished and large-scale organization disappeared. The key lesson here is complexity equals fragility. The more interconnected your system, the more dependent your Mycenaean warrior is on tin from Anatolia, and the more dependent your Anatolian scribe is on grain from the plains, the more catastrophic the failure when a single vital link breaks. The early empires were like incredibly sophisticated machines built without sufficient fail-safes. However, collapse is not the end. It is a reset. When the centralized institutions, the taxing authorities, the scribal schools, the royal armies disappear, the local populations are forced to fall back on simpler, more resilient social structures. They discard the fragile complexity of the palace economy and return to local chiefdoms, family-based survival strategies, and decentralized trade. This simplification is key to survival. This necessary simplification brings us to a quirky tidbit. Following the societal collapse of the Bronze Age, many of the advanced technologies and specialized crafts, like the complex cuneiform script and high-quality bronze casting, were temporarily lost or simplified, but essential knowledge related to survival, such as basic agriculture and the new skill of ironworking, were widely disseminated and became more resilient in the hands of common, non-elite craftspeople. The ironsmith, remember, was less dependent on fragile trade than the bronze caster, and this locally sustainable technology survived the collapse and eventually fueled the rebuilding process. The world got simpler, but fundamentally, it got harder to kill. Collapse, therefore, is the violent, necessary precondition for rebirth. The Dark Age that follows is not a blank slate, but a period of fermentation. It is during this time that new political ideas, such as the Greek polis, city-state, emerge, replacing the centralized monarchy with decentralized, more participatory, for some, forms of government. The new political structures developed from the ground up are better suited for the decentralized reality of the Iron Age. The simpler phonetic alphabet, carried by the seafaring merchants who re-established trade, replaces the complex elite-dominated cuneiform of the palace scribes. The final culmination of this cycle is the rise of the classical world. The Greek and Roman civilizations, which will soon define the Mediterranean, are not entirely new. They are the direct powerful inheritors of the collapsed Bronze Age. They adopt the Iron Age's mass-produced weapons, integrate the philosophical questions of the Axial Age, and build their societies not on the shifting sands of a palace economy, but on the bedrock of small landholders and resilient local political organisation. The walls they build are stronger, the laws they write are more universal, and the armies they field are larger. You have walked the path of humanity, observing the slow, magnificent, and often brutal ascent from the savannah to the great city. You've seen that the human story is not one of linear, inevitable progress, but a perpetual cycle of innovation, complexity, stratification, vulnerability, and collapse. Every civilization you will ever study follows this same pattern. The seeds of the future, be they a new technology, a new philosophy, or a new political idea, are always planted in the ruins of the past. You stand now on the chronological border between the world of the humans that lived before us, the hominins, the Neolithic farmers, the Bronze Age kings, and the world we call classical. Your journey through the deep past has revealed that everything you are, everything you do, and everything you believe is a layered product of all those who came before. You carry the fire of H. erectus, the genes of the Neanderthal, the grain of the Neolithic farmer, and the ethical dilemmas of the Axial Age prophet. The whispers of the ancient world are fading now, the shadows on the cave walls dimming. You've journeyed so far and seen so much. The cold stone tools of the older one, the flickering warmth of the first controlled fire, the vast shimmering land bridge to the Americas, and the stern, unyielding walls of the first cities. Let the dust of the savannah and the grit of the ancient clay settle. The long drumbeat of history slows now. Your mind, so active and engaged tonight, needs a moment to quiet, to process the immensity of that passage of time. Feel the softness of your pillow. Know that you are safe and warm, a culmination of 2 million years of relentless striving and successful survival. Every comfort you enjoy is a direct result of the ingenuity of those who came before. A tiny thank you for the stone chopper, the bone needle, and the stubborn will to keep walking and keep building. Let go of the names, the dates, the empires. Focus only on the sense of connection, the knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn. The great work is done, the thinking is finished. The world you inhabit now is calm, the journey complete. There is nothing left to do but drift. Allow your breathing to become slow, deep, and even. May the lessons of the past give way to the peace of the present. You are home.